Let's continue our discussion of food chains. And the purpose of this diagram is to show you what can happen if there is a disruption of the food chain. So let's say, for example, that we have something introduced into the water, given that this is a water situation, that kills this primary producer. Well, if this is not there, then this primary consumer has nothing to eat and it dies, and it goes right back to this big guy up here. You see that in each step is dependent on the previous step. Now, there are situations where there are alternative food sources, like if this, let's say in another situation, this beast dies, and this guy usually eats this animal right here, or this shrimp or whatever it is, he may have an alternative and may be able to survive. But if he doesn't have an alternative, he will die. And if this guy doesn't have an alternative, he will die, and so forth. And so there are situations where things can be introduced into the food chain that can cause one aspect or one link in that chain, and that's why it's called a chain, is because there's links one to another in sequence, and in some cases, if one link is broken, the whole chain is broken. Now, another aspect that I want to point out here is the idea of biomass. Biomass is the measure of the total dry mass of an organism within a particular region. Now, the reason we have to introduce this concept is because of what we're showing here is called a biopyramid. An ecological pyramid, or a biopyramid, is a diagram that shows the biomass of organisms at each trophic level. And it's generally a pyramid because there's generally more organisms in the earlier trophic levels than farther up the pyramid. So, for example, the first food chain will have the largest amount of biomass. Now, this, shrimp are not producers. They're not producers, they're consumers. So this is the primary consumer, and it has the largest biomass, that is dry mass. Then that's followed by the bleak, which have a smaller biomass, etc., etc. Now, one reason that it works this way is, again, because each step is dependent on the previous step. And so it's important that there be more primary consumers than secondary consumers. Otherwise, the secondary consumers will die out, and so forth. And so each step, that's why it looks like a pyramid. The base is the widest, and you get to the smallest part, which is the offspray at the top. Now here it shows that they're about the same. That's generally actually not true. That generally, unless you can determine that one offspray can eat one northern pike and survive on that in such a way as that they're balanced that way, that's usually not true. But this shows that in terms of mass, as you move up the food chain, there's less and less mass to support for energy. Now let's take a look at this, a problem related to this. It says, which graph, this is an energy diagram below, which graph represents the relative energy content of the levels of this pyramid? Okay, so here we have the pyramid. We start, 4 is at the bottom and 1 is at the top. Now I told you that as you move up the pyramid, the energy is lost. And so you start with the most energy at the bottom and go to the least energy at the top. You also start with the most biomass at the bottom and the least at the top. Now this is relative energy versus levels, and this actually shows the opposite, that the least amount of energy is at the bottom. So this one's not right, and these other two are not right because they're mixed up. This one, this number 4, is the only one that shows the most energy at the bottom and a sequential decrease in energy as you move up the pyramid. So this is the correct answer. Mutualism. You will recall that we defined mutualism as a situation where two organisms live together and each benefits from the other, as opposed to commensalism, is which two organisms live together and one of them benefits and the other is not affected, or parasitism, which is when two organisms live together and one is damaged by the relationship and the other is benefited. So here are some examples of mutualism. Now this first example is right over here, and this is called a clownfish, and these are sea anemone. And this is also in your book, an example that's in your book. And sea anemone capture their prey because they swim into their tentacles and they're stung, and then the venom from the sting kills them. Now, for some reason, and in the book it speculates that there's a difference in the mucus of the clownfish, but for some reason the clownfish is not affected by the sea anemone venom. And so they can swim through here without being damaged. And so the way this works is these tentacles actually protect the clownfish from its predators, and at the same time the clownfish attract other fish to the sea anemone and increase the likelihood that the sea anemone would get some food. So that's one form of mutualism. Here's another situation. This is a fish that I can't remember the name of right now, but he is always associated with this blind shrimp. And it's called a blind shrimp because it doesn't see very well. Now the blind shrimp lives in the ground, but from time to time it has to come out and fix its lair. It has to dig around here. When it does that, it puts its tentacle on this fish, and this fish has really good eyesight. And so if this fish sees a problem, he swims off, or he does something in such a way it's detected by the blind shrimp, and the blind shrimp takes off and hides at the same time. Again, both are benefited by this relationship. And this is a picture that was in your book, and this is a fish that has its teeth are right in here, and it eats, and it doesn't have any way to clean its teeth. And this is another fish that swims into this fish's mouth and cleans this fish's teeth for it. This fish gets a meal, and this fish gets to clean teeth. And they actually have places in the coral called cleaning stations that the fish swim into, that these big fish swim into, and they sit there with their mouth open, and in swims these little guys, and they go through this process of cleaning. And despite the fact that you'd think that he might chomp down on him, he doesn't, because he knows that he's doing him a favor there. So those are examples of mutualism. Now I show this to show what can happen if the mutualistic relationship is damaged, and I want to particularly focus on this mutual relationship on this side, which is the honeybee and the flower that it's sitting in. Now the honeybee flies into the flower and receives nectar from the flower, and at the same time pollen from the male aspect of the flower attaches to the bee and is spread to the female part of either this flower or other flowers that this bee may visit. So the bee gets nectar and the flower gets pollination, and without those two things the plants suffer and the bees suffer. Well, the reason I mention this is that there's been a problem with the bee population, and many people are concerned if the bee population drops below a certain amount that this will impact the flower's ability to pollinate and spread. So not only is the bee affected if its population is affected, but also the mutual organism that it has a mutual relationship with. Now we're going to move on to various cycles, and cycles are the way that various materials in the ecosystem or on the planet move through or recycle. It's kind of interesting. If you read Ecclesiastes, you see that he actually talks about the cyclic nature of things in the environment and in nature. And in his eyes, that's Solomon's eyes, this seems to be somewhat futile or vanity, he says. And he talks about the rain falling and the going into the water and then coming back, etc. And he's literally talking about these cycles that we'll be talking about here. Now here, we're talking about the water cycle. So this is the way water circulates through the environment. And what we have is we have sources of water. We have lakes, we have oceans, and these sources of water frequently give up water in the form of condensation. And so, as it says here, the ocean contributes about 80% of the water vapor that's in the air. So all the water vapor goes in the air and it forms into clouds. And these clouds travel around and they end up in certain places, and then it rains, and the water goes from the ocean through the cloud and into rain and begins to fall. And this rain either runs off and back into the ocean, or it runs into a lake. There are also water areas, it calls this the impervious layer. That means that water that comes into this ground can only go so far. And so, as I said, this is a diagram that water comes from and where it goes in an ecosystem. So this water comes down, and water inside the ground is called groundwater. And this is like when you dig a well, this is what you're looking for, is you're looking for groundwater. Now, water can also come off the plants, and that process is known as transpiration. And so plants themselves, after they absorb water, they have little pores in the leaves, and these pores will allow water to escape from the plant. And when water escapes from the plant, that's known as transpiration. That's actually controlled by cells called guard cells in the plant. Now, when water runs off and it ends up in a single water source, like this lake here, for example, then that's called a watershed. That area is called a watershed. So if you have an ecosystem that you've defined, and all the water of that ecosystem ends up in a particular place, or a particular body of water, or a particular lake, then that ecosystem is known as a watershed. Now, I show this to show what can happen when the water is contaminated in some way. For example, there are different ways that water can be contaminated. Remember, water is constantly circulating. There's not new water being created, so there has to be a way to remove all the bad things that end up in water out so that it can be used again. And if you have a landfill, for example, and it has some toxic chemicals in it, that can get into the groundwater and cause a problem with the groundwater. Similarly, if you have a place where people live and you have septic materials, that is waste products from those people, that can also seep into the groundwater, and things that have to be done in order to prevent that from happening. Another possibility is the leaking of other materials, say oil or solvents, into the groundwater. All of that can get into the groundwater, and once the groundwater is affected, then when you have a well, it ends up affecting the water in that well. And so that's why we have to be cognizant of groundwater and where our groundwater comes from. At this point, I'm going to stop, and we will talk about several other cycles in the next